Okay, so last class we talked about development and using agile process. And what we're going to look at is factors in running a software project. So factors, one of the biggest costs of running a software project is the cost of your employees. So the factors we're taking into account are the salary, which is your base pay. It could be an employee who's working on a yearly salary or hourly rate. They could get overtime pay, bonuses. The cost of benefits, like a health plan, dental plan, education, if you're sending your employees out for education after work. Company has to pay employees taxes, state, federal, unemployment insurance. How much space you have to pay, for the office space and desk space, the actual cost of having an employee working for you, and then the equipment you're giving them. Beepers, pagers, phones, pens, pencils. So if you take the cost of all of those and amortize them out by all your employees, you get the loaded cost for an employee, how much it costs to have an employee working for you. So the general value of an employee, what makes a good employee or a bad employee? The things you're looking for in a technology company would be maybe their education, their experience, their problem-solving skills, how much drive they have. They could be, highly educated with a lot of experience, but they don't have any drive to get anything done, so that might not be such a great employee. And when you're evaluating an employee, you might want to take a weighted average of maybe some of these categories. You could add more categories, put more weight on some categories. And it's popular now to evaluate everybody from 1 to 5. Everything seems to be evaluated from 1 to 5. Uber, right? You take an Uber drive, you evaluate from 1 to 5. So a lot of companies now evaluate their employees, each one of these, maybe on a scale from 1 to 5, and then have some kind of a weighted average to figure out value. So now the idea is the utility. We talked earlier in the semester about utility value, but the utility value of a function, of an employee, could be, factors might include the employee's general value, your company's needs for that particular skill set, are there duplications in your skill set for a particular employee, and then the cost of the employee. So you want to know how much you're paying for this extra employee, and then compare that to the utility, the value that they add to your existing company. So just an example of utility would be, let's say you had a rock and roll band, and let's say a rock and roll band needs a singer and 1 or 2 or 3 guitar players and 1 bass player and a drummer and a keyboard player and a saxophone player. But some of these are maybe optional and some might not be optional. So can you hire a great saxophone player? Well, depends on what type of band you are. But if you do a lot of songs that have saxophone, then maybe you want to pay for a saxophone player. But you have to ask yourself, does that help your band that much? If you play the kind of music that doesn't use a saxophone too much, you might be paying for a very expensive saxophone player, and you don't really need a saxophone player. If you have 2 guitarists and you would like to hire a 3rd great guitarist, does that make sense? Well, if you already have 2 great guitar players, you can hire a 3rd one, which would be very expensive, but it won't change the value of your band too much because you already have 2 great guitar players. So the extra value of the 3rd one is not that much compared to the cost. And if you have a great singer, should you hire another great singer? There's not too many bands that have like 2 great singers. So if you already have one, the utility of the new one might not be that much needed. So it depends on what you need, what the person you're considering hiring, how much increase in value does that person give you, and then subtract that from how much cost they are. That's their utility. So remember when we talked about Agile had 12 principles. Well, their principle number 6 is the idea that it's most efficient for people to work face-to-face as opposed to telecommuting and working over the phone, having meetings over the phone, sitting in a small place and working out issues on almost a daily basis. When we're talking about agile development, we were saying that sometimes they'll have a meeting, a scrum, once a day, like let's say 4 p.m. They get together and say, what'd you do today? How much progress did you make since yesterday's 4 o'clock meeting? And that's hard to do if you're not working face to face. And like we said, 25 years ago, it was very popular work, very large projects scattered, teams scattered throughout the country, throughout the world. So just want to keep in mind when we're talking about, because here we're talking, today we're talking about working remotely and people being scattered. So just want to keep in mind that that kind of violates Agile's principle number 6 out of 12. So working remotely, working from somewhere else, typically from home, but somewhere else, there's pros and cons to that. Some of the pros are you save money on office space and equipment. Now this would work if you actually take away the person's office and say work from home. If they have an office and then they're working from home and the office is sitting empty, you're not really saving a lot of money. So you kind of want to, like for example, Oracle has a lot of their employees working from home and there is no office space. There's no office to come into if they wanted to. Another pro would be there's no commute for your employees, so they could spend more time working. Instead of driving 45 minutes to get to work and driving 45 minutes home, employees now have an extra hour and a half every day to work. The employees save on the cost of commuting, so they don't have to put gas in their car and pay tolls. So you can actually pay them less, because they don't have to spend as much money coming to work. And there's also tax advantages to your company. So it is pretty popular to do. Some companies like doing this. Like I say, Oracle does this a lot now, have their employees working remotely. There's also cons to it. There's the loss in value of the employees being together. Again, that's kind of the principle number 6 of agile development. It's hard to separate work and personal activities. Right? So you're sitting at home, you're working from home, and you're watching Oprah Winfrey, and then you've stopped concentrating on your work. And so there's distractions and lack of productivity. And then there's also, it's somewhat popular, there's a bad reputation that the people who come into the office think that the people who are working from home aren't working as hard. So we get a little of that. Okay, so then there's the idea of offshoring. So this is not just working from home, but the idea of outsourcing, which breaks into 2 categories, offshoring and onshoring. So the idea of offshoring, or outsourcing work, is to obtain goods or service from an outside or foreign supplier, especially in place of an internal source. Offshoring is when the employees that you are hiring are external to your organization and they are typically outside of your country. You're working offshore. Doesn't have to be across water. It could be like in the United States, you could be hiring people from Canada. That's also considered offshore. And onshoring is where you actually have the people from another country come to your country and work for you onshore. So this is you could have them face to face if they happen to be in the same building where you are. Okay, so now this is kind of from the point of view of the United States. So the technology workforce outside the United States. Found these statistics on, they're on Google. I Googled these, I think they're on Wikipedia. But anyway, there's a dramatic difference between how much you would have to pay a programmer in the United States versus someone who is offshore. Dramatic difference in pay, and you also don't have to follow the United States rules of, minimum wage and how many hours you can work in a week without paying overtime. So it's very tempting to go outside of the United States or Canada when developing software. And so in the United States there was an H-1, without the V, just H-1 visa program. Actually goes back to the 1950s. And the H-1 H-1 program allowed people to move to the United States as long as they had some kind of skill that was not, that was in demand in the United States. This wasn't real, this was before computers really took off and the internet took off. But this would allow people who had distinguished merit or abilities to come live in the United States as long as they had a skill that was needed in the United States. The Immigration Act of 1990 added a new type of visa called the H-1-B visa, which allowed people with a bachelor's degree or higher, bachelor's, master's, or PhD, or the equivalent work experience to come to the United States. And they originally set the cap at $65,000 per year. So this would be in addition to the number of visas that were, you know, besides just regular visas. This H-1B was the new one that started in 1990. So it never quite hit the 65,000 cap on any given year until 1997. And that was the first time the cap was hit. So, so again, the H-1B visa is mostly for technology-related jobs, computer science majors, electrical engineering, so who are going to mostly be doing programming, some mathematical background, and just general technology. So here's a picture of Bill Gates, a couple of CEOs from different technology companies out in either Washington or California, came to the United States Congress to pitch for the need for more of these visas, because there was a big shortage of technology, people with technology skills, and the corporations back in 1990 felt they needed more people than we had in the United States. So wanted the number of visas to be increased. So by 1998, the H-1B visa cap went from 65,000 to 115,000 per year. Additional ones that could be added. So that was an increase of 50,000 visas. And by 2001, it went to 195,000, another 80,000 on top of that. Okay. And then between 2004 and 2018, the cap went back to 65,000. So, and just because the law expired, the law where it got raised, which goes back to 98. The law where it got raised, there was a schedule to be raised. It expired and was never extended, so now it's back to 65,000.
What does that mean, Professor?
What's that?
What does that mean?
What do you mean?
What was so the law expired?
Yeah, so it was originally from 1990 when it started was 65,000 a year, and it was always the people applying for it. There was always less than 65,000 people would apply every year until 1997. Then more than 65,000. So the cap got hit for the first time. So there's really no reason to increase it because there weren't enough applicants at the time. But by 97, the cap was hit. And then, so then in 98, they increased the cap to 115. So they passed a new law in 98 saying it would be like a schedule. Every year it would go up, and then it went up, I think it went up to 2003. So the law was in effect, I guess, for 5 years, the increase, and then that expired. So it went back to 65,000 again.
So that means not a lot of people applied, and that's the reason it came down? Is that
No, I'm not really sure why it came, I don't know if it went, there were less applicants, so they didn't need it. And I don't know why they didn't extend it again. I don't know if it's, do you know are there a lot of people applying for this and getting turned down? Are there a lot? There are?
Yeah.
The H-1B?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess there's more applicants than 65,000 per year.
I mean, I didn't know that there, like, in 2001, it was like this much, and then...
Yeah, it went up very high in 2001. It worked this way, like it went from 65 all the way up to 195, and then by 2004 it dropped back down. And I think there was an extra there's a master's degree cap too. If you have a master's degree, foreign worker holding a U.S. master's degree or higher, there's an additional $20,000 on top of the 65. And you can actually apply to both. So if you have a master's degree from the U.S., you could apply for this visa or this visa. And you know, if you get one, you don't need the other one. So. But you could try for this one. If you don't get it, you could also try for this one. So this is just a chart of you know, all the different types of visas. So there's an H-2A visa, which is a seasonal agricultural occupations, H-2B, seasonal non-agricultural. H-1B is specialty occupations, but it's mostly technology. Students that get an F-1 visa, and there's an OPT connected to that, the 139,000. So it's about 1.4 million, this was as of 2013, about 1.4 million visas somehow related to students or technology right now in the U.S. So then the idea of, you know, offshoring, suppose, so here's kind of, these are very hard topics to quantify, but suppose you have a project that needs 10 people to complete the project by a certain date. So here's some questions you might ask yourself. Why do you need 10 people? Maybe 8 good people can do as much work as 12 not so good people, so where did 10 come from? The 10 is kind of very tied to how good the people are. Why is the due date what it is? Do you have a customer saying, I need it by next September? You know, what would be the cost if you missed the due date? In other words, if you used 8 people instead of 10, it might take you a little longer to make, and maybe that would be okay. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe you really need to hire more people. And then what roles do you need to fill, and how long does it take to hire people? So that's also a big part of, you know, coming up with your startup budget, because you can't just like hire people like starting Monday. You have to interview them, you have to know what skills are needed, and it's not easy work running a small startup company. So just things to take into account when you're offshoring, like, do you need, when you say you need 10 people, if they're offshore, you might need 1 or 2 management people, because it's harder to manage people who are not coming into the office every day. Okay. And then here's just kind of a balance sheet looking thing, of an example of a software project. So suppose, for example, you want to estimate your labor. So you have contractor labor estimates. So suppose you have a project, instead of on a per person basis, suppose you think it's going to cost you about 3,000 hours to do the work, and you're going to pay the employees $150 an hour. Now you could be paying people annually and health benefits and that, you could calculate what that comes to per hour. So that'll give you the subtotal, you know, this many hours at this much per hour, this is how much your cost is going to be. Now, if you're offshoring the project, you might need some project management team members. So how many hours would they need just to manage the project that's scattered throughout the globe or throughout your area? And they maybe get, project managers maybe get approximately $75 an hour, which comes out to approximately $150,000 a year. If you have no benefits, it might be $20,000 a year if you do have benefits. And then your cost on a per hourly basis would be these two numbers added up. So let's say you had a project where your estimate is going to cost $594,000 to run. Okay, that's fine. One of the popular things is to use function point estimates. So how many, your product, how many inputs do you have, how many outputs do you have, and those are called function points. And you might want to do a function point analysis just to get also an estimate of how much it costs per function point, and see if that approximately equals what the cost of your, estimated cost of your labor. So if your product has, you know, so many inputs, so many interface files, so many outputs, so many queries go against the database, you have your total function points. Let's say your product has 175 function points, and then there's estimates like for Java 2 language equivalency values, it's 46 times, so 46 times 175 function points would give you, you'd approximate how many lines of code you'd have to write, how many source lines of code. Would be about 8,000 source lines of code. And there's a computation based on doing that project in Java, the amount of labor you would need. It would cost approximately $562,000 based on the product you're trying to make. So you're hoping that this number and this number are pretty close to each other. If this number goes much higher, which is what you're actually estimating you're going to pay to build this thing, you might be overpaying because based on the functionality of your product, it should cost approximately this much money. So, I mean, one of the toughest things, one of the things maybe just trying to get across in this video, in this lecture, is it is very hard to estimate a software project, how much it's going to cost to build it. Because there's so many variables, and one of the biggest, most expensive parts of running it is the cost of your employees. And there's a big difference between education and skill level of your employees, and then also where they're located, and like according to agile development, how well they work together would play a big role. And your ability to get people, if they're offshore and they can't get a visa, then you're going to be working with them remotely until their visa's approved. So all that has to be taken into consideration. Okay, so any other questions about that? So, like I said, this was a good follow-up to our Agile talk. Our Agile talk is just kind of assuming you have a small group of people all sitting in the same room working on a project. But one of the big ways of saving money is offshoring and outsourcing. But that takes into account an hourly or per person or head count point of view. And that gets into issues of how much the people not being together, how much of a utility cost is that, and then the different skill levels, different educational backgrounds, and how well their person's knowledge helps what your team is lacking. So if you already have 4 good database administrators, getting a 5th really good database administrator might not help your project too much. Maybe you need more Java programmers. So. Okay.